if we don't feel very comfortable with death, want to avoid death at all costs, and find death extremely awkward, how much more then do we find it awkward to deal with the feelings and the experience that comes with the death of loved ones? How much worse is it for us if we don't want to deal with death when death comes for those we love, and now we are experiencing grief? Grief is one of those things that's often very misunderstood and neglected, something that people try to avoid and escape. But it proves very necessary for all of us if we would find a way of living well in the face of the death of others and the face of a lot of loss that we can experience. We do well to consider what grief is about, what the scriptures say about grief, and how we as Christians should look at grief, both of ourselves and that of other people. What do we talk about when we talk about grief? Well, a standard definition is a multifaceted response to loss, particularly to loss of someone or something to which a bond was formed. Okay, what does that mean? Well, grief is that process by which a person kind of returns to a kind of equilibrium after suffering some kind of great loss. We normally talk about it in terms of death. When a person dies, that those who have loved that person and for whom that person was a significant part of their life will need to go through some kind of process by which they come to terms with that loss, find a way of appropriately honoring that person in their memory, yet be able to live their life in a healthy, honorable way. And that process is what we call grief. And this is especially true of somebody who is close to you as a spouse or a parent or a child, trying to come up with a new type of normal where the memory of that person can still be honored, and yet you are able to continue to carry on with life. And it's not limited to death, though. We can imagine a situation where there is a severance of a relationship, where it's like a death, even though the person is still alive, there's going to have to be some kind of grieving. When there is a change in relationship, if a marriage dissolves, if you have friends that you get distant from, or your situation in life, you lose employment, you have to move, you have all these different changes in life. And even beyond that, just the natural aspect of experiencing life, you go through phases of life, and as you enter a new phase, it means it's the end of another phase, and that is true for ourselves and also for those that we love, and all of those can be catalysts for grief. It may not be the happiest way of looking at life, but we can look at life as an attempt to navigate a series of losses, that we're grieving a series of little deaths, where we are looking at, hey, we graduate from high school, right? Well, we look at that as, graduation to a new phase where you're going to college or becoming an adult, but it's also the death of one's time as a high schooler. When you get married, it's a great thing to celebrate, but it's also the death of your life as a single person. You have children, a wonderful, beautiful thing. It's the death of being without children. And then as the children grow up, you have, the end of the various phases. And it's really depressing. Man, that's a big downer, isn't it? And yet, what happens when we don't grieve? What happens when we don't want to deal with these changes? We can often find ourselves in nostalgia. We often find ourselves not coming to grips with the changes, trying desperately to grab hold of a time where it was different. We might try to find coping mechanisms and self-medicate in ways that ultimately hurt us in many ways. So even though it may not be the happiest message, it is important to be able to look at life as that series of losses so that you can properly grieve each loss. Because if you don't, it's going to come back to haunt you. What does grief look like? This is a very challenging thing to talk about because everybody in their mind has this kind of stereotypical expectation of what grief looks like. And in fact, we will often sharply judge people who we expect to be grieving but aren't grieving the way in which we would expect them to grieve. The fact of the matter is that this experience of grief is going to be completely different for everyone, even for the same person in different times and contexts, because of a kaleidoscope of factors. So, how close are you to the person that you've lost, or how invested were you in that which was lost? What phase of your life are you in that in your grieving? What stresses do you have? What temperament do you have? What are some of the other things going on in your life? There are some people who will cry profusely in grief. There are some people who will not cry at all. There are some people who will turn inward. There are some people who will go outward. There are some people who get incredibly angry. There will be others who will prove more pliant. There are some who will retreat from their responsibilities, and there will be some who will throw themselves all the more into work and other responsibilities they have in their lives. There is no one way to grieve. There is no one particular right way of grieving. There's a whole range of ways that you may grieve because of the loss you're experiencing in various circumstances. There are many ways of grieving that are very unhelpful. Again, self-medication, participating or going out into various forms of sin, and those we wish to condemn and avoid because they're not really helping us move forward, are they? They are causing us even more grief and distress and very difficult things for us. But we need to remember that there's not one way to grieve, because it's bad enough and hard enough when you're in that experience already. It's made all the worse when people expect you to act a certain way and you feel like you need to perform a certain way to meet everybody else's expectation. As long as you are working through your grief, you're not actively avoiding it or trying to escape it, and working through it in ways that ultimately lead to healthy, positive ways, there's no need to be burdened to wonder if you're doing it right. And it may take far longer than you would expect or you would want, but it's time that is necessary. And it's something that we see consistent witness throughout the scriptures, people who are grieving. You can look at Jacob when he is told his son Joseph is dead. We know, his brothers know Joseph's not really dead, but that's the message they're giving Jacob, and Jacob accepts it. We see him in Genesis 37, 34, and 35 going through the mourning rituals of the time, tearing garment, putting ashes on their head, wearing sackcloth. He refuses to be comforted because of his loss. In fact, when he will find out later that Joseph is in fact alive, he'll be numb for a little bit, having to grapple with what he's grieved for so long, and his spirit then revives in Genesis 45, 26 through 28. Joseph himself will grieve for Jacob when Jacob dies in Genesis 50. When Saul and Jonathan die, David hears of it. He will actively grieve and lament and compose a psalm for the occasion in 2 Samuel chapter 1. When David's child Bathsheba, conceived in adultery, is very sick, David mourns, David grieves, hoping that maybe God will have mercy on him. But the child dies. When the child dies, David cleans himself up and carries on as usual, and is not condemned for thus doing. He will comfort himself in Bathsheba, and they will have another son, Solomon, who will have a much different legacy in 2 Samuel chapter 12. In the New Testament, in John chapter 11, we see how Jesus is greatly affected by the weeping and mourning going on around him. We might wonder, why is he going to mourn for Lazarus when he knows he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead? In fact, the reason that he did not come until now was so that this opportunity to bring Lazarus back from the dead is available. Well, because he sees the grief of Martha and Mary and the people around him, and he has a deep relationship with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. That's the one thing that John makes very clear. And therefore, seeing someone he loves grieving is enough for him to grieve. It is a powerful embodiment of that tendency to grieve with those who grieve, weep with those who weep, which we are called upon as Christians to do in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And in fact, in Isaiah 53 and verse 3, Isaiah prophesies that he would in fact be acquainted with grief. When Jesus dies, we see grief with the women of Jerusalem, the people watching the crucifixion in Luke 23, and in John 20, we see Mary Magdalene grieving for his death as she's about to learn of his resurrection. And so we can see that grieving is a part of life for all kinds of people in Old Testament, New Testament, throughout the Scriptures, and there's no condemnation of it. And that means we need to turn now to 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 13, where Paul is writing to Thessalonian Christians so that they would not grieve like those who have no hope. It is very unfortunate that many Christians, in very misguided ways, have attempted to chastise Christians for going through grief because of this verse. In their vain imaginings, they want to emphasize it as that you should not grieve like those who have no hope, as if the emphasis is on they should not be grieving at all. When in fact the passage could be read as that you should not grieve like those who have no hope. To me, the clincher for the argument goes to Philippians chapter 2. Because in Philippians chapter 2, when Paul is narrating how Epaphroditus was sick, very sick, sick to the point almost death, he thanked God that God had mercy upon him because Epaphroditus was spared, lest he have grief upon grief, sorrow upon sorrow. Paul is therefore a flaming hypocrite if he were to suggest Thessalonians that they have no right to grieve when he was in the position where he was about to do some serious grieving and already grieving the situation of his beloved brother. The fact of the matter is, what Paul is doing for the Thessalonian Christians is to give them comfort. The point is comfort. The comfort is that they should not grieve regarding the death of their fellow Christians like those out in the Gentile world who have no hope, because they have hope. The whole concern of the Thessalonian Christians is that, well, these Christians have died, Jesus hasn't returned yet. Will they share in the resurrection? And Paul wants them to know, not only will they share in the resurrection, they in fact will rise first. In 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 17, this is to be a comfort for them. And it should be a comfort for us when people we know who we have every reason to believe are faithful Christians, that they are resting in Jesus when they pass, and that we will be able to share in life with them in the resurrection. That should provide us some comfort. It should mean that we do not grieve like those in the world who have no hope, for which only thing there was in this life, and therefore death is the irreparable loss, with no hope in the future of anything better, and people who would grieve accordingly. And so we should absolutely not be chastising or shaming anybody about their grieving because of 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 13. And we should definitely rebuke anybody who would attempt to chastise anybody about grieving, acting as if in 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 13, Paul has somehow commanded us not to grieve. We are not to grieve as those who have no hope. But if we have loved, and we are to love one another, if we have loved one another, then when we have lost somebody, we're going to have to grieve that. Even if they're Christians, even if we have great hope for them, they are no longer with us, and we have to sort out how we're going to live our lives with honoring their memory and moving forward. So the scriptures do show that grief is a part of life, that we are going to have to go through. And it is natural, and we need to endure it. So how should we handle grief? Grief is a very natural reaction. If you love, you will grieve. Because you've loved, there is grief because there's that hole in your life. Say what you will about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. What they were dealing with in WandaVision with grief was pretty profound. And Vision's statement, what is grief if not love persevering, has a lot of weight to it. What is grief if not love persevering? That you have this hurt because they're gone. And sometimes it's not even the fact that they are gone. It's that some kind of hope is gone. Because we have to be honest that not everybody who passes on in our lives have we had the best relationships with. In fact, a lot of times it is a very difficult thing to deal with somebody who should have loved you in a certain way. A spouse, a parent, somebody like that who dies and hasn't been really reconciled. And now you're grieving what kind of experience you should have had with them. And so there's all kinds of reasons that you would need to grieve, not even just because of love, but also because of the lack thereof, very real at times. You have to deal with grief. You may act like you can push it off, or you'll just fight through, or you'll try to set it aside. You don't have time for it. None of us have time for anything that happens to us in life. Life does not happen according to our schedule. Things that happen in our lives are to remind us that our schedule needs to, in some way, adapt to the life that we're living. And if we try to push off grief, we're just going to make all of the pain and the suffering and the difficulties even worse. It's going to lead us to unhealthy coping mechanisms. We can see when people turn to drinking and alcohol, sexual promiscuity, but even just throwing themselves into work in an unhealthy way, trying to somehow numb themselves from what they're not trying to deal with. We need to give people the space to grieve. The people should give themselves the space to grieve. It's going to take time. The closer, the more intimate the person, the more time it's going to take. And it's not going to be a consistent, smooth ride. It's going to have peaks and valleys. And you need to take that time. And you might need time to yourself. But at the same time, you should not fully isolate yourself. Especially if you're a Christian, you need to have your fellow Christians be there to help encourage you and support you through this time so they can weep with you as you weep in 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 26. And so people should have the opportunity to grieve. We need to give that space to people, and if we are in that circumstance, we need to actually go through it. No one said it's a good time or a fun time, but it's absolutely necessary if there's going to be a kind of healthy equilibrium that is established. Again, not an attempt to dismiss the importance of that person in your life or to act like that you can just get over it. All right, that's some of those unhelpful words. We just need to get over it. It's not about getting over it. It's about, again, finding a new normal where the person that you loved is still honored in memory, or what you would have hoped is honored in some way, or it's recognized in a way that you can set that on the shelf, so to speak, in your life, and be able to continue to live your life in a way that isn't constantly burdened and chained down by regret regarding loss and missed opportunities and things of that sort. Just as important, if not more so, how can we encourage those who are grieving? Because if there's anything else that you get from our conversation today, know this: if someone has experienced a loss, let your words be few. So many times, horrendously awful things are said by people who theoretically are well-intentioned, but they see somebody grieving and they feel weird and awkward about it, and so they feel like they need to say something in order to address the weirdness and awkwardness of it, and most of the time you're just better off keeping your mouth shut. Consider the example of Job's friends. Only time you can look at them positively. When they start opening their mouths, all the problems start happening after Job chapter 2. But at the end of Job chapter 2, when they first see him, they mourn, they weep, lament, and they sit with him for 7 days. They give him the gift of their presence. We can certainly express sorrow for the loss the person has experienced. We can pray that God would comfort, strengthen, and sustain them through this time of grief. A lot of times our presence, though, means more than anything else, that we are there with them and for them, and they know that they are not going through this alone. In some situations, it may be appropriate to help with making sure that meals are provided, chores are being done, cleaning is done, to look at these various things to help the person as they're going through this difficult time. Then we need to remember that person well after the event, right? People think well of people and who are grieving after the moment it happens, after the funeral. But what about 6 months later, a year and a half later? Are you willing to honor the memory at the various anniversaries? The first time the person's birthday comes around, or an anniversary, anniversary of the day of death, etc., etc. And it's such a difficult thing to say in generalities because it's very specific about the relationship you have with the person grieving. But a lot of times we think that we need to avoid talking about the person who has passed, as if just kind of acting like it'll all go away if we stay silent, when in fact what that person wants more than anything else is to have the person remembered well, to talk about the good times, to share in positive memories. And again, that's something that you have to navigate with the person. The person who is going through the grief needs to be the driver in these circumstances. And those who are not grieving, who want to support them, to truly weep with those who weep, do well to take their lead and to find ways of being supportive and constructive. That grief is a difficult thing to work through, but it's something that should be done with fellow Christians. And fellow Christians need to do a lot better at grieving well with those who grieve, to mourning with those who mourn, and to weep with those who weep. There is a time for laughing, the preacher said in Ecclesiastes 3:4, and thus there is also a time for mourning. That if we've not already experienced it, the longer we live, the more people we love, the more likely we're going to experience grief. And therefore we do well to prepare ourselves for that time when our loved ones will no longer be physically with us, to prepare ourselves for the fact that we go through all these transitions and that we need to be willing to grieve what we're setting aside or moving beyond as much as we are excited and take hold of what is coming on in front of us. That we need to endure that sorrow so we can establish a new, healthy normal. And let the rest of us show true strength and encouragement around those who grieve. So let us serve God in times of mirth and sadness. Let us all set our hopes fully on the day when we will not have to grieve anymore and can share in the resurrection of life. We're so glad that you've joined us today. If you have any questions or comments about our conversation about grief, please let us know in the comments, and please subscribe to us so you can continue our conversation. I'm Ethan, work with the Adventist Church of Christ. We are a non-denominational church of Christians in Los Angeles that love to be of encouragement and service to you. If you'd like to study the Bible with us, or to have a Bible correspondence course, or to have a prayer request, or to meet with us, that we can be of any kind of service, please reach out to us at AdventistChurchOfChrist.org. You can also find us on social media and all kinds of platforms, Adventist Church or Adventist Church of Christ. We again thank you, and may the Lord bless and keep until we're able to meet again.